The sound of her body hitting the concrete wall echoed through the military base like a gunshot. In that split second, 30 pairs of eyes turned toward the commotion, expecting to see another typical altercation between soldiers. What they witnessed instead would become the most talked-about incident in the base's history, a moment that would expose prejudice, challenge assumptions, and ultimately transform how an entire unit viewed leadership and respect. She stood up slowly, brushing dust from her uniform, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the shock radiating through the crowd. The Marine who had just assaulted her was already beginning to realize his career-ending mistake, but he had no idea just how catastrophic this moment would become. Because the woman he had just thrown against the wall wasn't just any soldier. She was someone whose identity would turn his world completely upside down. In a military culture built on hierarchy and respect, what happens when those very principles are shattered in one explosive moment? This is the true story of how one act of violence revealed hidden truths, challenged long-held beliefs, and proved that sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the most unexpected sources. The morning sun cast long shadows across Camp Pendleton as Marines shuffled toward the mess hall, their boots creating a rhythmic drumbeat on the concrete paths. It was supposed to be just another ordinary Tuesday in 2018, the kind where routine drills and paperwork filled the hours between reveille and taps. Nobody expected that this particular day would become a defining moment that would be retold in military circles for years to come. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Martinez had been walking alone when she noticed the commotion near the equipment storage area. At 34, she had seen enough military drama to usually keep walking and mind her own business. But something about the raised voices and aggressive posturing made her pause. 3 Marines were surrounding a smaller figure, their body language screaming intimidation and hostility. The person in the center was clearly trying to defuse the situation, speaking in calm, measured tones that seemed to only irritate the aggressors more. What caught Jennifer's attention wasn't just the obvious power imbalance, but the fact that the victim appeared to be a woman, something that immediately triggered her protective instincts. In a male-dominated environment, female Marines often had to watch out for each other. As she moved closer, she could make out the conversation more clearly. The 3 Marines were led by Corporal Jake Thompson, a man whose reputation preceded him. Thompson was known throughout the base as someone who believed women had no place in combat roles, let alone in positions of authority. His vocal opinions about female Marines had earned him unofficial warnings from superior officers, but nothing official had ever stuck. "You think you can just waltz in here and tell us how to do our jobs?" Thompson's voice carried across the courtyard, filled with contempt and barely controlled rage. "I've been in this unit longer than you've probably been in the Corps. I don't care what some pencil pusher in Washington thinks about women in combat." The woman in the center remained calm, her posture straight and professional despite being outnumbered. She was smaller in stature than the men surrounding her, probably around 5'4", with her dark hair pulled back in regulation style. What struck Jennifer was how composed she seemed, as if she had dealt with this kind of situation many times before. "Corporal Thompson, I understand your concerns, but this isn't the appropriate way to address them," the woman replied, her voice steady and authoritative. "If you have issues with recent policy changes, there are proper channels to express those concerns." This seemed to enrage Thompson further. His face flushed red, and his fists clenched at his sides. The 2 Marines flanking him, Corporals Mike Davis and Tony Rodriguez, seemed to feed off their leader's energy, stepping closer to create an even more intimidating circle. "Prope channels." Thompson laughed bitterly. "You mean the same channels that are forcing us to babysit people who can't even meet the physical standards? The same channels that are more concerned with political correctness than military effectiveness?" Jennifer found herself moving closer, her instincts telling her this situation was about to escalate beyond verbal intimidation. She had witnessed enough conflicts to recognize the signs of impending violence. Thompson's body language was shifting from aggressive to dangerous, his weight moving to the balls of his feet, his shoulders squaring up. Other Marines had begun to notice the confrontation as well. A crowd was slowly forming at a respectful distance, drawn by the raised voices and obvious tension. Most seemed content to watch from afar, unsure whether to intervene in what appeared to be a dispute between fellow service members. The woman remained remarkably calm, but Jennifer could see the subtle changes in her stance. She was preparing for what might come next, her feet positioned in a way that would allow her to defend herself or create distance if necessary. Her hands remained at her sides, non-threatening but ready. "I'm going to ask you one more time to step back and return to your duties," the woman said, her voice carrying a note of finality that suggested this was Thompson's last chance to walk away. Instead of stepping back, Thompson moved forward. "Or what? You'll report me to my commanding officer? You'll write me up? You think anyone around here is going to take your word over mine?" The tension was now palpable. Jennifer could feel her heart rate increasing as she watched the scene unfold. She found herself calculating distances, wondering if she could reach the group in time if Thompson decided to get physical. The smart move would be to call for military police or find a nearby officer, but there wasn't time. "I don't want to report anyone," the woman said, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the obviously escalating threat. "I just want us all to do our jobs and maintain the standards of conduct expected of Marines." Thompson's laugh was harsh and mocking. "Standards of conduct? That's rich coming from someone who probably got her position through some diversity quota rather than actual merit." The insult hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Even from her distance, Jennifer could see how the words affected the woman, not with anger or hurt, but with what looked like disappointment and resignation, as if she had heard these accusations countless times before. Davis and Rodriguez seemed emboldened by their leader's words, nodding in agreement and making their own crude comments under their breath. The circle around the woman was tightening, and Jennifer realized she needed to act soon or risk witnessing something that would have serious consequences for everyone involved. But before she could move, Thompson made his decision. Without warning, he stepped forward aggressively, invading the woman's personal space in a clear act of intimidation. When she didn't back down, maintaining her ground with quiet dignity, something snapped in the corporal's mind. "I'm sick of this political correctness bullshit," he snarled, his face now inches from hers. "You want to play soldier? Let me show you what real Marines deal with." The woman's response was measured and professional, even in the face of obvious aggression. "Corporal, you need to step back immediately. This behavior is unacceptable and will have consequences." Those words seemed to be the final trigger. Thompson's face twisted with rage, and Jennifer watched in horror as he raised his hands, clearly intending to physically assault the woman. Time seemed to slow as she realized she was about to witness a serious crime that would destroy multiple careers and potentially result in criminal charges. What happened next would be replayed in witness statements, investigated by multiple agencies, and discussed in military circles for months to come. Thompson's hands connected with the woman's shoulders, and with a violent shove, he sent her flying backward. The sound of her body impacting the concrete wall was sickeningly loud, followed by an eerie silence as everyone present realized they had just witnessed a serious assault. The woman slid down the wall and sat on the ground for a moment, clearly stunned by the impact. Thompson stood over her, his chest heaving with adrenaline and anger, apparently satisfied with his display of dominance. Davis and Rodriguez looked shocked, as if they hadn't expected their leader to actually resort to physical violence. Jennifer was already running toward the group, her training kicking in as she prepared to render aid and defuse the situation. Other Marines who had witnessed the assault were also moving closer, some pulling out phones to document what had happened, others looking around for officers or military police. The woman slowly stood up, brushing concrete dust from her uniform. Her movements were careful and deliberate, suggesting she might be injured but was trying not to show weakness. What struck everyone present was her composure. Even after being violently assaulted, she maintained her professional bearing, her dignity intact despite Thompson's attempt to humiliate her. "Is everyone seeing this?" Thompson called out to the growing crowd, his voice filled with false bravado. "This is what happens when political correctness meets reality. Some people need to learn their place." But as Jennifer reached the group and got her first clear look at the woman Thompson had just assaulted, she felt her blood run cold. Something about the woman's bearing, her calm authority, even in the aftermath of violence, triggered a memory. The rank insignia on her uniform, partially obscured by dust, became clearer as she brushed herself off. Other Marines in the crowd were beginning to have the same realization. Whispers started spreading through the gathered personnel, and Jennifer could see faces changing from curiosity to shock to outright horror as people began to understand what they had just witnessed. Thompson, still high on adrenaline and convinced of his righteousness, seemed oblivious to the changing mood around him. He continued his rant about women in the military, about how this incident proved his point about female Marines not belonging in combat units. But his words were falling on increasingly horrified ears. Because what Thompson didn't know, what he was about to discover in the most humiliating way possible, was that the woman he had just assaulted wasn't some junior enlisted personnel or even a fellow non-commissioned officer. The rank insignia he had failed to notice, the authority in her voice he had dismissed as pretension, and the calm professionalism she had maintained throughout his verbal assault were all indicators of something that would change his life forever. Jennifer found herself staring at the woman's collar, an insignia that made her stomach drop. Around her, other Marines were having the same realization, their faces reflecting a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror as they understood the magnitude of what had just occurred. The woman straightened her uniform and looked directly at Thompson, who was still basking in what he thought was his moment of triumph. When she spoke, her voice carried the same calm authority it had throughout the confrontation, but now there was something else, the unmistakable tone of someone who was about to deliver consequences. "Corporal Thompson," she said, and something in her voice made everyone in the vicinity fall silent. "I believe you, and I need to have a conversation." The silence that followed was deafening. Jennifer Martinez watched as recognition slowly dawned on the faces of Marines throughout the crowd. What had started as curious onlookers gathering to witness a confrontation had transformed into witnesses to what would become one of the most documented cases of assault on a superior officer in recent military history. Thompson, still riding his wave of misplaced confidence, seemed completely unaware of the shift in atmosphere. He stood with his chest puffed out, apparently proud of his actions, while Davis and Rodriguez began to look increasingly uncomfortable. The two corporals were starting to realize that something was very wrong with the situation, though they couldn't quite put their fingers on what it was. "A conversation?" Thompson scoffed, his voice still full of arrogance. "Lady, the only conversation we need to have is about you finding a different career path. The Marines isn't a place for people who can't handle reality." Jennifer found herself holding her breath as she watched the woman Thompson had just assaulted. There was something about her demeanor that suggested she was giving him one final opportunity to recognize his mistake before the full weight of consequences crashed down upon him. The patience she was showing was remarkable, especially considering she had just been violently thrown against a concrete wall. Staff Sergeant Martinez had been in the Corps long enough to recognize authority when she saw it. The woman's bearing, her calm control of the situation even after being assaulted, and, most importantly, the insignia on her uniform that Thompson had apparently failed to notice, all pointed to a reality that was about to shatter his world. "Corporal Thompson," the woman said again, her voice carrying a weight that made everyone present lean in to listen. "Before this situation goes any further, I'm going to give you one opportunity to look at my rank insignia and reconsider your approach to this conversation. It was then that Jennifer noticed other Marines in the crowd beginning to step back, their faces showing a mixture of horror and anticipation. Some are pulling out phones, understanding instinctively that they were about to witness something that would be talked about for years to come. Others were looking around nervously, as if trying to decide whether they should intervene or simply document what was happening. Thompson, however, remained oblivious. His tunnel vision, fueled by anger and prejudice, prevented him from seeing what was becoming obvious to everyone else present. Instead of taking the woman's advice to look at her insignia, he continued his verbal assault. "I don't need to look at anything," he sneered. "I've been in this unit for 3 years. I know everyone who matters around here, and I've never seen you before today. So whatever rank you think you have, whatever position you think you deserve, it doesn't change the fact that you don't belong here." The woman nodded slowly, as if Thompson's response was exactly what she had expected. Jennifer could see a mixture of disappointment and resignation cross her features, the look of someone who had hoped for a different outcome, but wasn't surprised by the reality she was facing. "I see," the woman said quietly. "In that case, let me introduce myself properly. What happened next would be replayed in witness statements, investigation reports, and unofficial military folklore for years to come." The woman reached up to her collar and straightened her rank insignia, making sure it was clearly visible to everyone present. The late morning sun caught the metal, causing it to gleam as she positioned it prominently. Jennifer felt her heart skip a beat as she got a clear view of the insignia. Around her, she could hear sharp intakes of breath and whispered curses as other Marines realized what they were seeing. The woman Thompson had just assaulted, the person he had dismissed as unworthy of respect, was wearing the silver oak leaf of a lieutenant colonel. But the revelation was even more shocking than just the rank. As recognition spread through the crowd like wildfire, Jennifer realized she was looking at Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chun, the newly appointed commanding officer of their battalion. Chun had been assigned to the unit just 2 weeks earlier, transferring in from a successful tour in Afghanistan, where she had led combat operations and earned multiple commendations for valor. The reason Thompson didn't recognize her wasn't because she was unimportant or unqualified. It was because he had been on leave during her arrival and had missed the formal introduction ceremony where she had been presented to the unit. He had literally just violently assaulted his new commanding officer based on nothing more than his own prejudices and assumptions. Thompson's face began to change as he noticed the shifting mood around him. The smug confidence started to drain away as he saw the expressions of horror and disbelief on the faces of his fellow Marines. Davis and Rodriguez had gone completely pale, their eyes fixed on Lieutenant Colonel Chin's insignia with the look of men who had just realized they were accessories to career-ending disaster. "No," Thompson whispered, the word barely audible as the full magnitude of his actions began to sink in. "No, that's not, you can't be." Lieutenant Colonel Chun straightened to her full height, and despite being smaller in physical stature than the men around her, she suddenly seemed to tower over everyone present. The authority that Thompson had dismissed as pretension was now unmistakably real, backed by the full weight of military hierarchy and legal consequence. "Corporal Thompson," she said, her voice now carrying the unmistakable tone of command authority. "I am Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chun, commanding officer of this battalion. You have just committed assault on a superior officer, witnessed by approximately 30 of your fellow Marines. Do you understand the severity of your situation?" The words hit Thompson like a physical blow. Jennifer watched as his legs seemed to give out slightly, forcing him to lock his knees to remain standing. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking almost gray in the morning sunlight. Around him, Davis and Rodriguez looked like they might be sick. I didn't know," Thompson stammered, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. I didn't realize if I had known." Lieutenant Colonel Chun held up a hand, cutting off his desperate attempts at explanation. "Stop talking, Corporal. Right now, every word you say is potentially being recorded and will likely be used in the legal proceedings that will follow this incident." The crowd had grown larger as word of what was happening spread through nearby buildings. Jennifer could see senior non-commissioned officers pushing through the crowd, their faces showing the kind of concern that suggested they understood the serious implications of what had occurred. She spotted First Sergeant Williams making his way toward the group, his expression grim. "But, ma'am," Thompson continued, apparently unable to stop himself despite the warning he had just received. I thought you thought I was what, Corporal?" Lieutenant Colonel Chin asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "Please, finish that sentence. Tell everyone present exactly what you thought justified your actions." Thompson's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He seemed to realize that any explanation he could offer would only make his situation worse. How could he explain that he had assaulted her because he assumed she was unqualified, that he had thrown her against a wall because he believed women didn't belong in the military, that his prejudices had blinded him to her actual rank and authority? Jennifer found herself thinking about Thompson's reputation on the base, his vocal opposition to women in combat roles, his complaints about diversity initiatives, his general attitude toward female Marines. It all took on a different meaning now. This wasn't just an isolated incident of bad judgment. It was the inevitable result of prejudices that had been allowed to fester and grow unchecked. First Sergeant Williams had reached the group and was taking in the scene with the practiced eye of someone who had seen his share of military disasters. Jennifer watched as he noticed Lieutenant Colonel Chin's rank insignia, saw the defensive posture of Thompson and his companions, and observed the shocked expressions on the faces of the gathered Marines. His face went through a rapid series of expressions as he realized what had happened. "Jesus Christ, Thompson," Williams muttered under his breath, though his words carried clearly in the silence. "What the hell have you done?" Lieutenant Colonel Chun turned to address the first sergeant with the same professional composure she had maintained throughout the entire incident. "First Sergeant Williams, I need you to secure this area and ensure that all witnesses remain available for official statements. This incident will require a formal investigation." "Yes, ma'am," Williams replied immediately, his voice reflecting both respect and deep concern for the situation. He began barking orders to nearby Marines, establishing a perimeter and organizing the crowd of witnesses. Thompson seemed to be in shock, still staring at Lieutenant Colonel Chun as if he couldn't believe what was happening. The reality of his situation was clearly sinking in, but Jennifer could see that he still didn't fully grasp the magnitude of the consequences he was facing. "Ma'am," he said again, his voice now pleading, "please, if I could just explain. I've been having a difficult time adjusting to some of the changes in the Corps. I've been under a lot of stress, and Lieutenant Colonel Chin's expression remained impassive as she listened to his desperate attempts at mitigation. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, as if considering her response carefully. "Corporal Thompson," she finally said, "you're absolutely right that there have been changes in the Marine Corps. Women are now serving in combat roles, in positions of leadership, and in situations that were previously closed to us. These changes challenge traditional perspectives and require everyone to adapt their thinking." For a moment, Thompson looked hopeful, as if he thought she might be showing understanding for his position. But Lieutenant Colonel Chin wasn't finished. "However," she continued, "those changes don't excuse assault. They don't justify violence against fellow Marines. And they certainly don't give you the right to physically attack someone because their presence challenges your personal beliefs about who belongs in uniform." The hope faded from Thompson's face as quickly as it had appeared. Around him, the crowd of witnesses continued to grow, with Marines streaming in from nearby buildings as word of the incident spread. Jennifer realized that within hours, this story would be known throughout the entire base. Furthermore, Lieutenant Colonel Chun continued, "Your actions today demonstrate exactly why these changes are necessary. Your assumption that a woman couldn't possibly hold a position of authority, your failure to show basic respect for a fellow Marine, and your resort to violence when confronted with perspectives that challenge your own. These behaviors have no place in today's military. First Sergeant Williams had finished organizing the scene and approached Lieutenant Colonel Chun. "Ma'am, I've secured the area and instructed all witnesses to remain available. Shall I contact the military police?" "Yes, First Sergeant. Contact MP and inform them we have an incident requiring investigation. Also notify the Provost Marshal's office. They'll need to be involved given the nature of the charges that will likely be filed." Thompson's legs finally gave out, and he sat down hard on a nearby equipment crate. The full weight of the situation was clearly hitting him as he heard official procedures being put into motion. Davis and Rodriguez stood nearby, looking like they were trying to figure out how to distance themselves from their leader's actions without appearing to abandon him. Jennifer found herself thinking about the ripple effects this incident would have. Thompson's military career was effectively over. Assault on a superior officer was one of the most serious charges possible under military law. Davis and Rodriguez, as witnesses who had participated in the intimidation leading up to the assault, would likely face their own consequences. The entire unit would be affected as the investigation proceeded and the story spread. But beyond the immediate legal consequences, Jennifer realized she was witnessing something historically significant. This incident would become a case study in military schools, a cautionary tale about the dangers of prejudice and the importance of respecting all service members regardless of gender, race, or background. Lieutenant Colonel Chun had remained standing throughout the proceedings, showing no signs of the impact she had absorbed when Thompson threw her against the wall. Her professional demeanor never wavered, even as she dealt with the aftermath of being violently assaulted by one of her own subordinates. As the military police arrived and began their preliminary investigation, Jennifer watched Thompson being read his rights and led away in handcuffs. The image of him, dejected, defeated, and facing the destruction of everything he had worked for in his military career, served as a powerful reminder of how quickly prejudice and violence could destroy lives. The investigation that followed would become one of the most thoroughly documented cases of assault on a superior officer in recent military history. Within hours of the incident, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chin's assault had sparked conversations at every level of the military hierarchy, from the Pentagon down to individual units across all branches of service. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Martinez found herself called in as one of the primary witnesses 3 days after the incident. The Criminal Investigation Division had set up a temporary office in the base's administrative building, and the stream of Marines coming and going for interviews had become a constant reminder of the gravity of what had occurred. As Jennifer sat in the sterile interview room, facing CID Agent Captain Rebecca Torres, she reflected on how the base had changed in just those few days. The incident had created a palpable tension throughout the unit, with Marines either whispering about what had happened or maintaining an uncomfortable silence on the subject entirely. Staff Sergeant Martinez, Captain Torres began, consulting her notes. "You were one of the first witnesses to respond to the scene. Can you walk me through exactly what you observed?" Jennifer had been over these details dozens of times in her own mind, but she carefully recounted everything she had witnessed. The intimidation tactics used by Thompson and his companions, the professional demeanor maintained by Lieutenant Colonel Chun despite obvious provocation, and the shocking moment when Thompson resorted to physical violence. What was your impression of Lieutenant Colonel Chin's behavior throughout this confrontation? Captain Torres asked. "Professional, ma'am. Completely professional," Jennifer replied without hesitation. Even when Corporal Thompson was being verbally abusive and clearly trying to intimidate her, she maintained her composure and tried to de-escalate the situation. Even after he assaulted her, she remained calm and focused on proper procedures. The investigation had revealed disturbing details about the culture within Thompson's unit. Multiple Marines came forward to report previous incidents where Thompson had made inappropriate comments about female service members, questioned their qualifications, and generally created a hostile environment for women under his indirect supervision. Corporals Davis and Rodriguez, initially thought to be mere bystanders, were found to have actively participated in creating the intimidating atmosphere that led to the assault. Text messages recovered from their phones showed a pattern of sharing misogynistic memes and making derogatory comments about women in the military. Both would eventually face administrative punishment and mandatory sensitivity training. But the most shocking revelation came from the investigation into Thompson's background and performance records. Despite his 3 years in the unit, his fitness reports showed consistent problems with authority, particularly when dealing with female superiors or peers. There had been informal counseling sessions, verbal warnings, and written reprimands, all of which had been handled at lower levels without escalating to formal disciplinary action. Lieutenant Colonel Chun, meanwhile, had become an unwitting symbol for women serving in combat roles throughout the military. Her handling of the assault and its aftermath had been widely praised by senior officers and had sparked discussions about the challenges faced by women in leadership positions within traditionally male-dominated institutions. The base commander, Colonel James Patterson, had called for a comprehensive review of unit policies regarding harassment and discrimination. In a base-wide address 3 weeks after the incident, he made clear that Thompson's actions were not representative of Marine Corps values and that such behavior would not be tolerated at any level. The Marine Corps has always prided itself on being an organization where performance matters more than personal characteristics, Colonel Patterson had told the assembled Marines. Corporal Thompson's actions represent a failure to live up to those standards, and his consequences will reflect the severity of that failure. Thompson's court-martial had been swift and decisive. Faced with overwhelming evidence and multiple witness testimonies, he had pled guilty to assault on a superior officer, conduct unbecoming a Marine, and failure to obey lawful orders. The military judge had sentenced him to 6 months in military prison, reduction to the lowest enlisted rank, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and a bad conduct discharge. But for Jennifer Martinez and many other Marines who had witnessed the incident, the legal consequences were only part of the story. The real impact was in the conversations it had started and the changes it had prompted throughout the military community. First Sergeant Williams had implemented new training programs focused on respect, diversity, and professional conduct. Every Marine in the battalion was required to attend sessions that directly addressed the attitudes and behaviors that had led to Thompson's downfall. This isn't about political correctness, Williams had explained to Jennifer's unit during one of these sessions. This is about military effectiveness. When we allow prejudice and disrespect to flourish, we weaken our ability to function as a cohesive fighting force. Every Marine, regardless of gender, race, or background, deserves to serve in an environment where they're judged by their performance, not their personal characteristics. Lieutenant Colonel Chun had continued to lead the battalion with the same steady professionalism she had shown during the assault. If the incident had affected her emotionally, she never showed it publicly. Instead, she had used the situation as a teaching moment, speaking at military leadership conferences about the importance of maintaining standards and addressing discrimination before it escalated to violence. During a unit formation 6 weeks after the incident, Lieutenant Colonel Chun had addressed the Thompson situation directly for the first and only time in public. "I want to be clear about something," she had told the assembled Marines. "What happened with Corporal Thompson was not about me personally. It was about respect for the uniform, for the institution we serve, and for each other as Marines. His actions were a betrayal of Marine Corps values, and his consequences reflect that betrayal." She had paused, looking out over the faces of Marines who were still processing the implications of what had occurred within their unit. But I also want you to understand that this incident doesn't define this battalion. We are defined by how we respond to challenges, how we support each other, and how we continue to uphold the standards that make us Marines. I have complete confidence in this unit's ability to learn from what happened and emerge stronger. The impact of the incident extended far beyond the immediate unit. Military publications had written articles analyzing the case, using it as an example of how personal prejudices could undermine military discipline and effectiveness. The story had become required reading in leadership courses at military academies and professional development schools. For Jennifer Martinez, the most lasting impact was personal. She had been promoted to gunnery sergeant partly based on her quick thinking and professional response during the incident. More importantly, she had been selected to serve as one of Lieutenant Colonel Chen's senior advisors, a position that had exposed her to higher levels of military leadership and decision-making. "You handled yourself well that day," Lieutenant Colonel Chen had told her during their first one-on-one meeting in her new role. "Your instinct to protect a fellow Marine, regardless of rank or circumstances, exemplified what we expect from our non-commissioned officers." The conversation had led to discussions about leadership, about the challenges women faced in military service, and about the responsibility all Marines shared to maintain standards of conduct and respect. Jennifer had found herself with a new perspective on her own career and responsibilities. Davis and Rodriguez had both been transferred to different units after completing their administrative punishments. The experience had apparently been a wake-up call for both men, who had written formal apologies to Lieutenant Colonel Chun and had volunteered for additional diversity and sensitivity training. Their careers would continue, but they would forever carry the mark of having been involved in one of the most documented cases of discrimination and assault in recent military history. The broader Marine Corps had used the incident to reinforce training programs and policies designed to prevent similar situations. New guidelines were established for reporting and addressing discriminatory behavior before it escalated to violence. Unit commanders were given additional resources and training to identify and address cultural problems within their organizations. Lieutenant Colonel Chun had been selected for promotion to colonel ahead of her peers, recognition not just of her professional competence, but of her exemplary handling of an extraordinarily difficult situation. Her promotion ceremony had been attended by senior officers from throughout the military, many of whom spoke about the importance of the precedent she had set. "Leadership isn't just about what you do when things go well," General Patricia Myers had said during the promotion ceremony. "It's about how you respond when faced with the unexpected, the difficult, and the challenging." Colonel Chen's response to an unprovoked assault demonstrated the kind of character and professionalism we need at every level of military leadership. For Thompson, the consequences had extended far beyond his military service. The bad conduct discharge had made it difficult for him to find employment, and the publicity surrounding the case had made his name recognizable in ways that affected his personal life. He had eventually found work in construction, far from the military community where his actions had made him infamous. But even Thompson's story had an unexpected epilogue. 2 years after his discharge, he had reached out through official channels to request permission to send a letter to Colonel Chun. The letter, which she had chosen to share with select members of her staff, was a lengthy apology that acknowledged the depth of his mistakes and the harm he had caused not just to her personally, but to the military community as a whole. In the letter, Thompson had written about his time in civilian prison, where he had been forced to confront the prejudices and attitudes that had led to his downfall. He had participated in counseling programs, had worked with mentors from diverse backgrounds, and had slowly begun to understand the broader implications of his actions. "I realized that an apology can never undo the harm I caused," he had written, "but I wanted you to know that your professional response to my inexcusable behavior taught me more about leadership and integrity than I had learned in my entire military career up to that point. I hope that someday I can demonstrate that I've learned from this experience and become the kind of person who contributes positively to society rather than tearing it down. Colonel Chin had shared the letter not to excuse Thompson's actions, but to illustrate the potential for growth and change even in the most difficult circumstances. She had used it as part of leadership training sessions, demonstrating how maintaining professional standards could have positive impacts that extended far beyond immediate consequences. The incident at Camp Pendleton had become more than just a cautionary tale about the consequences of prejudice and violence. It had become a case study in leadership, in the importance of maintaining professional standards under pressure, and in the potential for positive change even in the aftermath of serious misconduct. Years later, when Jennifer Martinez had advanced to become a sergeant major, she would often tell the story to young Marines under her supervision, not as entertainment or gossip, but as a powerful reminder of the values that define military service and the consequences of abandoning those values. The Marine Corps is built on the principle that every person who earns the title Marine has demonstrated the qualities necessary to serve, she would tell them. When we allow prejudice to override that principle, when we judge people based on characteristics that have nothing to do with their ability to serve, we undermine everything the Corps stands for. The concrete wall where Lieutenant Colonel Chun had been thrown against still stood at Camp Pendleton, unmarked and unremarkable to casual observers. But for those who knew the story, it had become an unofficial monument to the importance of respect, professionalism, and the consequences of allowing prejudice to override military values. The incident had proven that even in an institution as structured and disciplined as the military, personal biases could lead to devastating consequences. But it had also demonstrated that when leaders responded to challenges with integrity and professionalism, even the most difficult situations could become opportunities for positive change and growth. Colonel Chun continued to serve with distinction, her career becoming an inspiration for women throughout the military. Her handling of the assault had set a standard for professional conduct under pressure that would be studied and emulated for years to come. The incident that could have ended her career instead became a defining moment that highlighted her exceptional leadership qualities and reinforced the importance of maintaining military standards regardless of personal circumstances.